week's conversation on race and policing. Today, we will be joined by Dr. Thaddeus Johnson from Georgia State University. Before we begin, I would like to read our land acknowledgement. We recognize that California State University San Bernardino sits on the territory and ancestral land of the San Manuel Band of Mission Indians, Yuhaviatam. We recognize that every member of the California State University San Bernardino community has benefited and continues to benefit from the use and occupation of this land since the institution's founding in 1965. Consistent with our values of community and diversity, we have a responsibility to acknowledge and make visible the university's relationship to Native peoples. By offering this land acknowledgement, we affirm Indigenous sovereignty and will work to hold California State University San Bernardino more accountable to the needs of American Indian and Indigenous people. I'll turn this over now to Robbie Madrigal.
Thank you, Matt. As Matt mentioned, our special guest today is Dr. Thaddeus Johnson. He's a former ranking law enforcement official in Memphis, Tennessee. He's an assistant professor of criminal justice and criminology at the Andrew Young School of Policy Studies at Georgia State University. His current research focuses on police policy and innovations, urban violence, crime control, and racially disparate justice outcomes. He's the author and co-author of numerous articles and reports and a book entitled Deviance Among Physicians, Fraud, Violence, and the Power to Prescribe. In addition to having his research featured in national media outlets, he has written on police reform issues for the popular press and appeared on numerous broadcast radio and TV news programs in the US and Europe. And I just want to say, Dr. Johnson, when we reached out to you, you were incredibly gracious in accepting our invitation, and we're so glad to have you with us today. Dr. Johnson, it's all yours.
No, thank you all so much. And, and it's always felt like, with like-minded people, so it feels like family. And, I saw the email and the fact that it's a university with all these things that we hear about race and politics, that we have an academy. Remember the academy who's really at the forefront of having these difficult conversations, because these are the conversations that help us get the change. Reform is not pretty. It's ugly. You got to get dirty a little bit. And sometimes it's more than that. And so, today I just want to kind of let you all know that people use the term like expert in these things. And we had this conversation earlier. I always feel like a student that is so much for me to learn. Each time I approach this, I don't take it for granted. I understand that people that look like me don't get opportunities to have conversations like this in a safe space. And so I'm more than honored. And so let me go ahead and share my screen with you. I do want to, I always tell my students, before someone talks to you, it's important that you know their heart, that you know who they are and where they're coming from. And so again, thank you for having me. And I hope nobody's job is on the line because of this talk, because if it is, you might be in trouble. So I hope we have no issues with that. A little bit about myself, in my scholarship, I never wanted to be a race and police scholar. I wanted nothing to do with policing. I wanted to focus on juvenile justice, school to prison pipeline, but not policing. But here we are, right? Having grown up in a Black family in South Memphis, to parents who experienced the ugliness of racism in the South, we've kind of always viewed the police as a necessary evil. And I think that's a sentiment that's shared across many communities. And I'm going to be talking about the Black perspective a lot. And if for those who can't see me, I'm a Black man with dreads. And so, and also the data, from life experiences, I know that. Also from the data, unfortunately, we don't have good national data that gets at other things besides Black people and white people. And that's unfortunate. Even in our research, when we look at our Latinx and Hispanic brothers and sisters, that what we see is that we really don't know what the outcomes are because there are different measures and how they're collected. It's not uniform. And so how do you allocate resources? How do you make things better? Right. And so I won't delve into that part of things today, but I really want you all to know, where I'm coming from. As a police officer, I was a supervisor. I trained officers in use of force. Yes, the band shoulder pin restraint or the carotid neck holds that we talked about, those are part of the curriculum. Back in those days, I was from in the early 2000s. It's been a while since I've been out the game, but I did it for 10 years. Defensive tactics, officer survival. I worked on task force with homelessness, drugs, also with some white collar crime and things. So I was blessed to have experiences on both sides of it. My wife often calls me a walking paradox. Today, we're going to talk about things like the fear of crime. I mean, fear of crime, but also the fear of police, and how I experience this to this day. From even when I had a uniform on with my captain's badge on till if I walk out right now and just train these officers in a leadership course, it's something that does to my blood. It's a stress that I think if we don't take these things seriously and realize that reform is an equity and a humanity matter, we're going to miss the mark, and we're going to continue having these same conversations that unfortunately that we're still having today. So real quickly, speaking of that, my parents always said there's nothing new under the sun. And 55 years ago, the government rejected the Kerner's Commission's conclusions and solutions. And basically what they said is that to end the destructive racial disorders required reversing the nation's centuries of anti-Black exclusion and discrimination that the police enforce, getting at these systemic inequities that underlie and oftentimes dictate where police and when they are deployed in certain places. And so it's unfortunate that 55 years ago, we were having this conversation, and we're still having this conversation. And so just today, this call was renewed from Lyndon B. Johnson all the way to Barack Obama. The Task Force on 21st Century Policing that's co-chaired by Lori Robinson and Charles Ramsey, they outlined 8 steps to kind of get us moving forward. And so they did acknowledge that the country is stuck here at this place of wanting reform and making incremental change, but we still have communities that are still suffering. And this didn't start here. So that kind of leads us to my question today: where's the real reform? And why do we have to wait on it? And why we shouldn't have to wait on it? What does real reform in the 21st century seem so elusive? And why is this the case? These are things that we're going to talk about today. And this is most important. How can we generate the reform to help improve both public safety and community relations? Now, again, I don't say I have all the answers, but I do have some insider perspective. And I've been privileged to be blessed to dedicate the last few years of my life to really understanding what's going on. And what's going on is having some real conversations and acknowledging some hard truths on both sides, and understanding that we all have skin in the game and that we all have a role to play. And I won't get into these things because when I get into trouble oftentimes, I say definitely the government, the police have a role to play, but when I'm talking about the Black community, we have a role too. And it's hard to ask someone who's been abused, who suffered from discrimination, time and time again, to draw a line in the sand if we want to move forward. But remember, reform is not pretty. Reform is ugly. Reform is trying. All right. And we're trying to provide relief for communities who are suffering the most. So let me just briefly talk about my research. Now, in our research, I try to disprove that disparities exist, right? Not prove that they exist. I try to disprove. And I guess, unfortunately or fortunately, wherever you sit on the side of how you view it, race matters. No matter what denominators I use, no matter how I try to ask questions, the different ways I try to measure, it comes back the same. And the reason why I take that approach, because it just seems that if you want to maintain the status quo, you don't need evidence. If you want to promote and evoke change, you do. And that's all right if that's the arena that we're in. And so that's a game that I'm playing. All right. So let me talk about real quickly. I had a reporter ask me one time, Dr. Johnson, how can you remove the racism and the other isms out of policing? And I just simply said, well, how can you remove the isms and racism out of American society? If you answer me that, then maybe I have a question for you. And it's not to say that we're hopeless, but we got to keep it real, right? We need actionable reform, and we can't tiptoe around these real issues. So even in our work, so for instance, in our work on whether departments offered or required a college degree requirement or a 2-year college degree, in those agencies across 16 or 17 years of data, what we found, over 200 some odd agencies, what we found that those agencies that required a college education degree for new hires, they had lower rates of police fatalities involving Black people. However, the flip side was that in those same cities that Black people in those cities were 5 times more likely to be arrested than their white counterparts. So it kind of goes to show how complex reform is, and that oftentimes it's not just one thing. You need a suite of reform that coalesce together, not just piecemealing and sticking things and hope they will work, because you're wasting time, money, and oftentimes people's lives. In our facial recognition technology, inequities, let's throw some technology at it. Artificial intelligence, that's the way to go. Well, in our research on facial recognition technologies, what we found that departments that deployed that technology, the citizens were no more or no less safer, but it was associated with higher arrest rates for Black people and lower arrest rates for white people, contributing to a widening disparity. So it goes to show you that there is no such thing as a magic bullet, and we have to really understand at its core, excuse my language, what the hell is going on. So from our work and from our experiences, there are some key things that I feel like has been preventing us from moving forward. Of course, you need reforms like you need to diversify the police force. Of course, we need to better resource our police departments. I am definitely not one of those that fund the police things, because I'll talk about it later. In many communities that need the police the most, they want police. They just want to be treated like human beings. And also in these very communities, society is taking everything else from them. If we're going to take away the one form of inkling of security, we have other ways to do so. Also, there's differential violent offending and victimization in our Black communities. It does not, now let me say this correctly, it does not mean that my people are inherently more violent. The violence is symptomatic of something else that's much deeper going on. And then also, the performance evaluations are out of step in policing with the nature of community building. Oh, you want community policing. Oh, you want more community building and innovation. But if you're not rewarding officers for that, but you're rewarding them for making arrests and traffic citations and the small part of the job, mind you, policing is not this benevolent thing where we're doing it for volunteer work. They have mortgages, they have families, they have kids, they have debt, they have things that there are people as well. And so oftentimes when I see these incidents, these signatory incidents in the news, I get upset because we immediately point at the officer, but that behavior did not happen in a vacuum. Who should we hold accountable? We'll talk about that some today. And then also, we have asked police and held school teachers and others for far too long to do too much. And what we have come to do have relied on police officers for the totality of public safety services, when many of these things are beyond their pay levels and their level of expertise. The criminal justice system is a blaming and punishing institution. And we struggle with the parts that are not that. How do we pick up the pieces? How do we reimagine? But we can do so in a way where we don't have to have false choices, right? It's not that I have to reform police or I have to improve public safety. Police reform is community reform, is public safety reform. It keeps us safer. All right. And that's what we'll talk about today. And so if I've done my job correctly, I would have challenged your perspective in somehow. Maybe I would affirm some, but if I'm doing what I'm supposed to be doing correctly, it's going to be some things that challenge how you see things. And not saying that I'm right, but if I can do that, that means it makes you think deeper about it. And I've done my job today. Okay. And this all kind of goes to say that if we want to think about policing and it not being this equity matter, our great grandkids will still be having this conversation. So it definitely keep advocates and us activists in business, because this still will be going around. Okay. You remember 55 years ago, these same things that I'm talking about were denounced and not accepted. So let me talk real quickly about fear of police, mistrust, and resistance. And this is a real conversation that we need to have, because we know that we have differential fear in Black communities. We have differential levels of mistrust, and police face differential levels of resistance. Scholars like Donald Black says that oftentimes that what goes on with that officer in that citizen in that moment oftentimes has nothing to do with those two people. It's a combination and the paying for the sins of generations and things before that comes to roost in that moment, not to dissolve bad behavior, But this is what we're working against, right? So just simply going and training the officers better, you tell me how that's going to resolve things when you're still rewarding them to make arrests for petty things in communities that are already burdened with debt and poverty and these things and being underserved. How do these things help? How can we move to a fairer, more compassionate justice system? This is what I'm talking about today. And I mentioned earlier about being a Black man myself. Growing up in Memphis, it's funny when I hear stories, I talk to my mom about, she told me as a young kid, as a young man, like, you respect the police, not because they've earned it, so I can come home alive, right? So that's ingrained, right? And some people can say, well, I was training some police leaders and they were like this white officer. He said, well, I get it, but how can I overcome that? Because that starts at birth and at that age. I didn't have an answer for them, right? Because this is what we're up against. It's complex. And sometimes it's not about having answers. It's simply asking the right questions. And that's how we get there, right? Sometimes I feel like I should be a great politician because you can kind of talk around the answer, right? But sometimes it's not that easy and not that simple. And if I tried to say so, I'll be lying to you. And that's not why I'm here today. And look, I know that oftentimes when I have conversations about community trust, it sounds like kumbaya. It sounds this very abstract thing, but let me tell you something. Its consequences are real, and they can be lethal and fatal. And so we need to really understand how to bridge these gaps and take it seriously. So oftentimes when I'm talking to people, and I'm in the media and doing these things, you get a lot of email and people are very brave online, right? But the one question that I often get is, well, if you don't want to get beat up by the cops, or you don't want this, why don't you just comply? And you know what? That's a fair question. And I'm so glad you asked, because now I won't demonize you. I can educate you, right? And let me say this about today's talk. It's not to demonize police officers or communities that they serve. It's to highlight these points that the right questions and understanding these things that we take for granted can really have profound implications. Now, you all can read on the screen, so I just want to talk a little bit, but studies show that humans unconsciously react to perceived danger in 3 ways: fight, flight, or freeze. And if anybody knows anything about policing, they can get you killed or seriously injured. Now, the fear response can be compounded by mental health issues, substance abuse issues, and these things intensify when there's a power imbalance, like when there's a Black man confronted with a cop on the side of a road at nighttime. There's a power imbalance where you almost feel like you're caged. And for a number, and think about it, many of these use of force incidents that we've seen that have made the news, they weren't there for arresting serial killers or rapists or robbers. Eric Garner was selling Lucy's. George Floyd, alleged $20 counterfeit dollar bill. Rashard Brooks fell asleep in the drive-thru of Wendy's in Atlanta. So this is not to absolve the police officers involved, but where does that come from? What's the trigger? How can we remove that trigger? Many Americans find police interactions to be traumatic. Research shows that there's PTSD associated with many Black people, particularly young Black men, when they're stopped by cops. I grew up listening to hip hop and rap music, right? It seemed like every damn song had a police siren in it somewhere. And so I could be riding around and hearing the siren, and my heart almost jumps out of my chest. I've been riding around just coming from training officers with my uniform on, with my gold badge on, and been pulled over. And my heart's racing, and I know I outrank them. If I'm at the university and I'm safe. I'm in my office, oh, this is that. But as soon as I walk out, and an officer even looks at my way, when I have to think about, I want to engage this officer, I have to walk the walk that I'm talking, and I have to engage this officer, why do I have to think twice about whether I should engage them and just say hello? This is the plane that we're up against. So I say we all have a role to play. And one thing is acknowledging the role of that fear. And it's an emotion, and it doesn't have to be quote unquote real. When officers are involved in police shootings, it doesn't have to be for certain. It has to be an imminent fear of serious bodily injury. So there's legal authority to show that fear is powerful and profound. And when you have such levels of distrust that's so deeply seated, it's hard to overcome that. And again, simply hiring more officers that look like the communities that they serve, it goes a lot deeper than that. I think we saw that with the case of Tyree Nichols. I could tell you about the many racial epithets that I've been called as police officer, and even today in this work by members of my own community. And so there's a lot of trauma, there's a lot of hurt, and there's a lot of pain that we have to overcome, but it's not insurmountable. Sorry. Now, again, I like to show a lot of data because I want you all to know that I'm not just making this stuff up, right? That they bought this black guy with these dreads down, and he just started spewing everything and making these things up. No, this is a Gallup poll that shows that this has been a problem historically. We've seen that after 16, 17, you saw deep declines with the amount of confidence that Black people have in their police forces. But this is a thing that is really the paradox I talk about. This is another Gallup poll around the same time, right after the George Floyd incident when he was murdered. Black Americans want security. They want police. They're just afraid of them. They're a necessary evil. These are the things that we're trying to overcome. And in our research, it shows that you need to have a short-term, mid-term, and a long-term plan to provide relief for different levels if we want to build trust, but at the same time, provide increased safety. I even go back to think about the Minneapolis vote that was shortly after the incident happened with George Floyd and Derek Chauvin. And 3/4 of the Black Americans of voting age voted against defunding the police. And so oftentimes it makes me think, who is driving the police reform narrative? Have we silenced the voices of those in the very communities being served and hijacked this for political points and performative praise? And these are things that even as a researcher, when I'm reading things, I have to be mindful of the perspectives in which they come to make up real decisions. But that really raised that question for me when these things were going on. All right. So we talked about the fear and that lack of trust. And let me say the one thing about the fear and the lack of trust that we return to when I talk about the reward structures. Even when I was my most professional, it's something about that moment when you're about to take someone's liberties away. And so as you see, once we get past this part here, there's ways that we can remove that trigger and quit bothering our citizens and oppressing them unnecessarily, while at the same time making our community safer. Now, if we're going to have this, though, it's important that we have a really important conversation and understanding that, for example, because of systemic inequities that underpins how things go in our society, if we started right now, at this moment, and snapped our fingers, and the justice system became completely fair, the police force became completely fair, tomorrow, when we start our practices, disparities will still exist. So what it tells us that oftentimes that our law enforcement, oftentimes our justice system plays the hand that they're dealt. And unfortunately, the dealer is systemic inequities and discrimination. And so, yes, over-policing, yes, police brutality and mass incarceration are cause and consequence of systemic inequities. But if disparities and injustice exist in everyday life, it's difficult to remove these matters from policing and the justice system. And so how can we realistically move and appreciate reform if we can't change the entire world? Because we're waiting on this, it may be a long time coming before we get some relief and some reform. So I'll tell you today, the most pressing issue that we have in criminal justice and public safety is equity and effectiveness in curbing disproportionate levels of community violence. Because it's certainly not the stop and frisk things that we saw over the 90s and 2000s and still see in many places today, even though quiet is kept. It's not that type of policing that will have great impacts on crime. And also, I tell these things, and I'll talk about it in a few slides. It does not matter if you arrest the gang leader, if you arrest the dope boy on the corner, because guess what? Somebody's going to take their place. I always tell students, if I was that gang leader, that dope boy, and the police came and arrested my rival, I'm like, thank you, Mr. Police. I'm going to contribute to the police benevolent fund because you just did me a favor. And so it shows that we have to really, really want to reform. I don't even like using the term police reform anymore. I want to stop using it because to me, it says that police are separate from the communities that they serve. We need community reform. We need community empowerment. Oftentimes the men and women in uniform, and this is what having an insider's perspective kind of has. Do we always get it right? But most people want to do the right way thing. Most officers don't want to have to ever pull the trigger. Most officers, and let me tell you right now, if many officers could do the job without having to go through that stress of making an arrest, particularly a high-risk arrest, and there was another way, they'll be the first ones to sign up, because if you do reform correctly, we keep our officers safer as well. All right. If we do reform correctly, we invest in officer wellness, because how the hell can we expect officers to protect our communities if they're not well, if they're not attended to? I remember being a police officer, and if an officer got involved in a fight, if an officer got beat up, if an officer was involved in a shooting, or you lick your wounds, we say it's legally justified. Okay, go back out there. How can you perform and function? As a police captain, I was bouncing in clubs with a gold badge on. I'm working in grocery stores, working 20, 30 hours of overtime a week on top of that. We expect that to be our finest. And so we have to really make investments in justice as well and empower our actors, but also the communities in particular that they serve. All right, I'm preaching now. Let me move on. What time is it? All right. So I know this is about policing, but we need to understand that, yes, the criminal justice system is decentralized, right? But people just don't go and volunteer to go into prison, right? They get there somehow, right? People accumulate a criminal history somehow, right? And so I will say this. It's important to acknowledge that the justice system, in many of its processes, in many regards, is the fairest that it's been in 2 decades. But that's kind of like saying, you jumped out, you drowned in water, it was on your forehead, now it's above your nose, right? I get that, right? But we have to acknowledge so we can understand where we're going. If you look at the disparity ratios, and this is from our work with the Council on Criminal Justice on racial disparities and imprisonment, we looked at the mechanisms of disparity, because remember, disparity is cumulative. Get a little bit of disparity at the systemic and neighborhood level, leads to more arrests, leads to more admissions, deeper criminal history. Then you may serve more time. Then you may not get good time or get able to get released on parole. Then it may determine your chances for success once you're released, right? And so these things are connected, at least for the people who are impacted. And so what you'll see is that the war on drugs has declined, at least in our big cities. All right, we can have another conversation about that. But if you look, the blue line on top, the largest gap that we have left in imprisonment, you still have gaps left. But the biggest gap now is no longer drugs. It's for violent offenses. If you look at the arrest rates on the right-hand side, the imprisonment rates on the right-hand side, you start seeing that the levels of the rates are higher for violence than it is for the other major categories of crime. And that's been for both races. Now, as we started determining how much has offending for non-fatal violent offending contributed to disparity? Because, it's the question is it differential treatment or is it differential involvement? Well, we know for sure, and research shows that the inequities in prison arrests, property arrests, drug arrests and particularly other minor crimes, that's related to discriminatory enforcement, whether it's because of how officers are deployed or simply because of their own behavior. But when we start looking at arrest disparities for violent offending, and this is non-lethal violent offending, if you start to notice toward the end on the right-hand side, is that the arrest rates and the offending rates converge. And what that means is that the majority of the disparity in arrests that we see for violent offending is associated with disparity in violent offending. And I always struggle saying that. But these are conversations that I think we've had, particularly in Black households around the table. We've just been hush-hush about it. It's been family business. And sometimes I even feel away by saying it because I know these things can be misconstrued. But if we really want to reform policing, it means reforming our communities. Because if we think we're going to police our way out of violent crime issue that we're seeing, we're going to police our way by, and mind you, yeah, violent crime, jumped up in many places after the pandemic. But if you look right here, Black people have long been more likely than anybody, 5 to 6 times more likely to be victims of homicide, in particular. I'm gonna let this sit there. This just didn't start yesterday at the pandemic. Yes, we saw increases in many big places like Los Angeles and other big cities during the first year of the pandemic. Those increases that we saw in violent crime were felt explicitly and only in Black communities, Black and brown communities. And so what's going on here to really understand that also that most victims and offenders have people of the same race, involve people of the same social background. So that tells me that something deeper is going on here. And we have to acknowledge this, that this is not something that police are going to be able to save us from. And this is reasons why I say that lengthier prison sentences or increased enforcement can only temporarily impact offending. Is not a sustainable way. Mind you, we're already for the past 20 years have been locking up people for longer than we have before. 2/3 of the offenders in prison, our state prisons right now out there for violent offenses. What more can we do? So research says that people tend to age out of crime, right? Also, a small share of individuals are responsible for a disproportionate amount of crime. And research out of the University of Penn about Philadelphia, I believe it was 1% of the population was responsible for 60 to 70% of all the serious crimes. So it shows that we can take an intelligence-led approach. But mind you, 1% sounds small, but 1% with a city of 5 million, 1% with a city of 1 million, hell, 1% of a city with 100,000. That's quite a bit, particularly when it's cohorts. It's not, oh, you got this one group, that's it. You have cohorts. How can police reform impact that? Solely as dependent on them for that. Then you have the replacement effect I talk about. You arrest one person. If you don't address those underlying issues, it's going to be very hard to make a dent in the criminal markets, particularly the evolving criminal market that we've seen since the pandemic. So what this does says to me is demonstrates that the need for something else, right? We got to do something else, right? Because it doesn't mean that we're more violent in these communities. But this conversation is often shunned. And like I said, doing so, these communities continue to suffer. I mean, this is racial gaps rooted in the legacies of slavery, segregation, discrimination has left Black people with disproportionately less wealth and less health, right? I don't mean to rhyme, but I guess, it's befitting. Lower access to healthcare and lengthier prison sentences, right? And such factors also contribute. We have high levels of incarceration and arrest and enforcement in communities. It tends to contribute to already high levels of concentrated poverty and blight and these community conditions that encourage offending. I mean, hell, in Black communities, federally funded research shows that in Black communities, in poor communities, the air we breathe is dirtier, it's more polluted. That has long-term effects for child development, cognitive development, and all these different things, shorter lifespans in these communities. So a lot of these things we're talking about, it really runs deep. And even we talk about housing, we talk about job training. And it's one thing to train for a job, but if nobody will hire you, where does that put you at? So as you see, I'm getting beyond policing. And as I move to the next slide, so where does police fit into this conversation? Well, I'm so glad you asked that question, because we need to change police culture in the game of policing. How? So let me say this. So cities tend to evaluate and reward police departments based on the number of clearances, based on the number of arrests, based on crime rates, and all of these things. But that's only about 15% of the job. Crime fighting is about 10% of the job that police officers spend their time doing. 80 to 85% of the job is community building. 85% is time that you spend patrolling and doing preventative enforcement, or you could be. But how the game of policing is right now, when you reward officers for traffic stops, when you reward officers for making arrests, and not even high quality arrests. I'm talking about shoplifting. I'm talking about vagrancy. I'm talking about things that have no public safety value. Is it that the officers want to make these arrests? Yeah, you have some gung-ho, I'm trying to watch my mouth, gung-ho officers out there. But how we evaluate our police officers almost forces them to treat our citizens like commodities for advancement. Look, if your new officer come out the academy, you're probably going to be put in the neighborhood with the highest rates of crime at the worst shift, which is probably the midnight shift. You know how you get off those shifts traditionally? It's not being kinder and gentler and building a community. It's about writing tickets. It's about being productive. It's about enforcing. And problematically, when I talk about these tickets and how it's connected, it's so embedded how we have, as a society, perverted justice through how we govern the economics of it, that many places, and particularly your smaller areas, there's a story about a public defender in Florida. Her office is funded majorly by the revenue from tickets and fines. But of course, she's one of the last ones to get it. So if we don't have officers writing tickets, the people may not get representation at all. That's a conundrum. And this is how we've kind of perverted the game of policing and justice. And so how do we move forward? What time is it? I got about 10 more minutes and I promise to shut up. It's the police culture and the game of policing. It's the department's emphasis on quantitative performance metrics. I hate telling the story, but I don't know if my wife attends today, but I always say, when we do this thing, it's kind of like I can imagine being married to a comedian. Oh my God, how many times have they heard the joke? So I don't see her around here, so hopefully she's not in here. So I always tell this story about when I was a young officer and I helped change this lady's tire on the side of the road. It's raining and I'm so hyped. I grew up watching Andy Griffin, like real policing is helping the old lady across the street just as much as catching the mass robber. Spend 45 minutes on it. And as an officer, you have to be accountable for every second that you spend. You have to turn in the activity log. I turn this activity log, and my lieutenant says, what's this call here? 45 an hour, what are you doing? Oh, Lou, I got soaking wet. Had to change my uniform. I didn't know I had to change this lady's tire. She was so, oh my God, she was so relieved. And he looked at me and said, we do not pay you to write effing tickets. We pay you to lock up behinds and not so nice terms and lock their A's up. This is what you get paid for. I don't want to see this no more. That much time on a call. I mean, that changed my perspective on things. And this is one reason why I know that we can change how we reward officers. And some agencies have done these things, right? And this is the thing. A large share of violent police citizen encounters come from traditional enforcement activities that, again, have not been proven to show any public safety value. Intelligence-led policing, focused deterrence, hotspots, focus and place and time-based approaches have really taken hold and shown to have these impacts without being so intrusive. And places like Dallas are taking those approaches a step further and say, you know what? We're using these quote unquote enforcement technologies to understand where the hotspots for crime are at. But how about we come in and hold these people accountable and these communities accountable, but we love on them with service providers. We holistically hold this community accountable. That's why places like Dallas, where everybody else during the pandemic was seeing things shoot up when it comes to violent crime, not them, because they have been taking this approach, a sustainable approach, and using intelligence-led policing to help provide other services as well, but not sacrificing public safety. One thing that really, and I was just mentioning this, is that, the game of policing, I liken it to like a football game. If you're playing football or baseball, the base hit is great, but everybody loves a long ball. In football, if you kind of slide and get a play, that's great. But if you run over you and crush your opponent, the crowd's going to cheer. That's not just in policing. Again, policing is a microcosm of our society, our celebration of violence, our celebration of run and gun. It's only a symptom of what happens in our broader society. And the same thing is rewarded in policing, because even if it's not about you becoming a lieutenant or a sergeant, you're still the one. You want to be the guy who gets, or gal who gets respected. You're the one who, oh, that's the running gunner. You're respected. And oftentimes, even your community members, they don't respect you, they fear you, and you can gain compliance. And that's not a healthy relationship or the makings of one, or a sustainable relationship. You know, when I was talking about, you know, traffic stops, imagine Tyree Nichols. If we didn't have a pretext stop, would he still be here today? Imagine Eric Garner. Imagine Dante Wright. If we didn't reward officers and promote policing of minor, trivial things, would these people still be alive? And would the damage to police-citizen relations be worse? And would it have had an impact on crime rates anyway? And a lot of the research we've been finding is that, I'm going to jump around real quick. In our research, we found that places that, if you see here, the emphasis on criminalization and law enforcement, like in Fayetteville, North Carolina. Fayetteville, North Carolina did this experiment. And what they did was, we're going to quit traffic stops for like things like you got one broken taillight, or if your tag is expired. And we're going to focus on reckless driving, excessive speeding, and these things. Let me tell you what happened. The homicide rate was the same before and after. All right, didn't make them more or less safe from that violence, but other crimes, crime rates went down. Racial disparities decreased in stops. Police had better hit rates when they did searches. Also, what we found was complaints went down, and guess what? Assaults against officers went down as well. We can keep our entire community safe without sacrificing public safety. You also have places like that prioritize community-based solutions, like Dallas again, the Dallas Stars program, where they partnered police officers in non-traditional clothing with service providers. And it worked. Great improvements, and they had to fight for funding. It had to be a miracle, the midnight hour, for funding to come through to keep this program going. And so, of course, you need things like no-knock warrant, banning these no-knock warrants, or stopping racial profiling. We need more data collection and reporting, but we're going to also need an anti-violence workforce and development of that group to work along with police as well. Everything's not an enforcement matter, and we can't enforce our way out of it. Even in places where you see where they remove the trigger in Philadelphia, they stopped doing these minor stops. Memphis has just started moving this way. And what we're seeing is it doesn't really have an impact, for better or for worse, on public safety. But what it does is it removes the unnecessary contacts with police and citizens, these unwelcome contacts, and it frees up police resources to be more responsive to service calls. They can work on community building and things like this. So these are things that places are doing that we really can take hold of. I mentioned officer wellness, and I will make this PowerPoint available with these links. So I'm just kind of skip around for time's sake. I do want to talk about the Cincinnati Police Department as well. Yes, it was from a consent decree. Yeah, it was a federal investigation that kickstarted it, but they took it bull by the horns, and they really dove into this whole thing of a guardian mentality, of involving the citizens, of having independent court and civilian review accountability, not just having a civilian review board that's optics, but a civilian review board that has some type of legal authority, subpoenaing power, and these types of things that we have to arm them with. They reduce the number of stops. They quit enforcing lower level crimes. They quit making petty traffic stops. And what they started to see was officers were safer, reduced crime rates. You saw positive, measurable change in citizens' attitudes toward the police and surveys. Fewer racially biased stops, fewer use of force incidents. And again, we keep our officers and our citizens both safe when we take this approach. Now, let me tell you about Cincinnati and how politics is important, and I'll move on. When they continued this approach, for about 10 years, they saw success. About 2017, 2018, they lost the political will. So this shows it just can't be a flash in the pan. We have to make a long-term commitment to reform. And the truth be told, it's a delicate balancing act, right? You're almost holding up by pins and needles to make sure that the bottom doesn't fall out to keep things going and growing. They lost the political will. The defund the police movement really took over. Citizens became torn about their views of policing and the role of them. And what we saw was this total plan just simply dissolved, and issues are just as bad now as they were before they even started this plan. You got things like Newark, who they changed their whole perspective. Now, mind you, we may not see things in crime rates and these great reductions in crime and violent crime, but what we saw was these officers did not fire a single shot. They removed more weapons. They made more stops, yes, but they say they made more stops because it was intelligence-led and they received tips. So it wasn't just random stop and frisk. They also did this program called Trauma to Trust programming that humanized both officers and citizens, where citizens can tell officers, this is what my life is like. When you all do these things, this is how it impacts me. This is how my family, my generations have been impacted by the system. And the officers get a chance to also discuss the trauma that they deal with as well and acknowledge these biases that we all have. About 500 people have done this program over the past 2 years. And these are the things that communities are doing that we don't have to wait on the federal government. We don't have to wait on the state government. Things are already happening in our communities. Ask, what can the federal government do? Finance the work that people are already doing on the ground right now. So as I wrap up, I just want to say that some lessons learned from state and local reform and lessons learned from our research is that we cannot reform police without reforming communities, and we cannot reform communities without reforming police. It's a multi-pronged approach. Don't think we're going to raise the education level and that's going to be it, because you raise education level, you need to raise the pay to compete with other industries. If you're going to raise the education level, you need to provide a way for officers who don't have a college degree to become educated and compete for promotions. Same thing with technology. One element alone would not suffice in the political will in understanding the limits and bounds of the criminal justice system and policing and getting community input and buy-in. We cannot go into communities and try to reform them or try to tell them what the police need to do. They need to give us permission. They need to be part of it. We need to allow them to have a voice. And we as academics, we as whomever, politicians, cannot hijack the voices of those who are on the ground, who feel, who suffer, who are doing the work. It requires investing in officers. In the city of Atlanta, a report came out last year that 50% of the cars, police cars, are not roadworthy. How can I serve the community if I don't have a car that can make it to the scene? And if I pull up in a car that looked like Barney Fife's car on the scene, are you really going to respect me as a police department? So optics and these things are really important. And also revisiting these reward structures. I know I'm giving you all a lot, and I'm going to stop here, but we don't change how we reward officers. It doesn't really matter, in my opinion, what type of reform we take. Community police has been around for 20, 30 years. Why hasn't it really taken hold? Because how we reward officers has not matched that guardian mentality. We still reward officers for warrior policing. And without changing that holistically, there's no way I can see of us really having long, sustainable reform. Because remember, policing is an industry. Policing is an employer by the government, and people don't do the jobs for free. Research shows that officers are generally policy compliant and that they adapt their behaviors to culture. So we see officers acting out. Should we simply make those officers scapegoat or hold leadership accountable? And also understand where this behavior comes from. What triggers this behavior? How do we remove this trigger? By removing and changing how we reward our officers. I think that's a really good point for me to stop right there. I could talk about this for months on time and put you all to sleep and lullaby you, but I do want to hear from you all. I know I gave you a lot, but I wanted to give a bird's eye view of what I think reform looks like and what the major barriers to reform are. So I hope those things came through. Thank you all so much.
And thank you. Very informative. A lot of information. So, what the last issue you made was rewarding the police, and my question is what we found over the series is we constantly reward the departments and so on. Like you said, better cars, better equipment, and so on and so on. And that always means bigger budgets. And the bigger budget tends to do more damage than good. In other words, the attitudes haven't changed. We just got more money to do the deeds that we've been doing. How do you react to that?
I mean, I think that's a very, very fair question. And I would pose to people, just fundamentally, I've never heard about taking investments away from something to make it better, right? So let me just say that from an industry perspective. Also, let me say most major police departments, not major, most of your police departments, because mind you, every department is not LA, every department is not Chicago, has these big, huge budgets, right, where they can defund and take money away. About 80 and sometimes 90% of police budgets goes towards salaries and pensions oftentimes, or salaries and the city pays out money for settlements, right? But salary and compensation is a big part of police budgets, particularly your traditional size departments. Even when you see things like the militarization of our police departments, they weren't necessarily receiving money. They were grappling after these resources that the federal government provided these police departments. And so the will is actually there. And some of our research is not published yet, but we found that departments that pay officers a higher relative wage, we saw decreases in police lethality across races. Now, I won't tell you what I found when we accounted for the presence of a union. That's a whole other ballgame. But what we're finding is that we make investments in the right places, you can have a much more efficient and effective police force. But you're right, we haven't truly dedicated and devoted to the community building model, to the guardian model. And the thing is that the reason why you see that money still going to these particular aspects or these quote unquote old school units, these old school crime fighting regimes, is that cities continue to reward departments based on those metrics and force them to do so. And so that's why I often advocate for, when you start talking about police reform, don't just stop at the police chief, right? Oftentimes police chiefs are only figureheads. We need to look at the mayors and the city councils, and we can demand the type of policing that we want. I think oftentimes as citizens, we forget about the power that we have. And I think so often we've been disenfranchised, particularly some group. I think so often we've become numb and tired of the politics, but we can't give up their role in it. And as long as our police departments continue to be judged based on those metrics, whatever money they get, these cities, these states, they're going to tell them, you got to spend the money in this way. We need you to spend the money, or imply that money needs to be spent that way. And so it's a really change the concept of how we think about it. But states like New Jersey, where Newark is, they simply said, in police evaluations, the governor passed a law saying in police evaluations, you cannot include the number of arrests or citations. And so those are states that started making moves in that direction. I still don't know if they start pulling back on traffic stops, or when they get more money for these new types of projects and things that's going on. Unfortunately, many times they're not evidence-based. And so you end up having the same issues. And oftentimes we're still not really funding and putting money into the communities. That really is where police reform really starts. And so I hope I answered your question on that.
Yeah, thank you. Just a minute, Mary, I got one more. So accountability, you hold the leadership accountable. One of the issues I have is, like the fire department, every police chief started as a patrolman, went up the ranks, became the chief. The reward and the attitude that he brought from patrol to the level of chief is pretty much the same.
Yep.
How do you change that?
No, absolutely, and thank you. That's a point that I should have made. I didn't make. So we should travel together. You really helped me. This is great. The problem is, if we maintain these reward structures and it all goes back, then that's going to determine who not only gets recruited and hired, but who gets promoted. And they're going to promote the same mentality that got them there, and that's the main mentality of the gatekeepers right now. And so that's a tough question. And so for me also,
Thank you. Go ahead, Mary.
Thank you, Dr. Johnson. That was quite enlightening and provocative, I have to say. You used the term community building several times, and I'm just wondering, how many hours are devoted to community building in the academy, and number two, has it been your experience, having some rank in policing, that the majority of especially white officers, and in California, it appears to be Latino officers also, who are, forming these gangs and so forth. How many of them, or what percentage of them do you think are really interested in community building?
I tell you, they're all interested in keeping their jobs.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm.
And so I'll start with that, right? And so you're absolutely right that, so how culture change happens, it doesn't happen overnight, right? And that's the problem with reform too, right? Is that even when you see about policies at the federal level, one president to come in, and we may not see those policies during their term, what we're seeing is stuff from the predecessor, right? And we don't have the willpower or the commitment, right? We just like things to move fast. That's a big problem. But you have officers who, they really just want to do their job, right? And if the job allows for running and gunning, they're going to do it. Now, I think many of those officers will probably leave and try to go to places that would allow that and hop around from department to department. But by changing the reward structure, you change the face. By changing the reward structure for community building, you change even who applies to be police officers. The first 4 years ago, when I first started teaching in the academy, I would ask, who wants to be a police officer? A quarter of the room. I ask now, nothing, nobody. And if it is, they want to do FBI or CIA or forensic, right? So I think we have to do like the Army in particularly, is make joining policing sexy, provide bonuses and benefits, because it's going to take time where the predominant culture are those officers of that mindset. And what we find is that the predominant culture in departments prevail, because just how you have some departments where you have officers who want a community build, but it's running and gunning, or I have to compete. I was there. I have to compete. If I want to not stay here and get more money, I want to be able to pay a car note and pay rent as well, then you have to change and sometimes go against what your standard of enforcement is. And that's why I left law enforcement. And so it works the same way, but over time, you'll see those changes, but it's not going to happen overnight. And unfortunately, I don't have a microwave answer for it.
Just a minute, Matt. And that's why I left law enforcement. And we hear that so many times. My wife came out of the military as a police officer, went to LAPD. They recruited her fast and wanted her in. And so she got there, she saw the mentality of the department. She goes, I'm not working here. And so we lose those people who could make the change. And even when we have somebody that gets hired that can make the change, he has a TO who doesn't say, I don't want you spending 45 minutes changing somebody's tire.
You know, you raised such a wonderful point, and I struggle because, you know, sometimes I feel like, did I just quit? And it took me talking to a reporter to say, no, you hadn't. You picked the fight up and you're doing it in a different way now. But it goes to show that, you know, without those proper supports in place, and, you know, and let me tell you, being a Black police officer can be lonely, right? It can be a lonely place. And if you ask many others, like, you know, I think about those pictures where I see like these protests and these Black officers who feel what the protesters are saying, but they understand their call of duty as well. And so it's just really problematic. And that's a problem that you have. It's not about, we focus on recruitment, but it's about retention. Because if you recruit and people leave, they'll never become leaders. And even if I made it up to the ranks, you know, I couldn't go any farther, unfortunately, somebody died or somebody retired, right? And that wasn't a guarantee. And I just wasn't patient because it needed to happen. I mean, hell, the first guy I arrested was on I'll say the name, on Dixie Road. That's the street behind Flynn Road. It's a street that my grandma's house was on. And so from the day one, I was like, yo, like, is this the change that I need? But then I see the victims and understand, wow, we need law enforcement. People need protecting. It is necessary. But I saw how justice can be perverted. And we talk about, you know, racism, discrimination that the police impart or against the citizens, but even think about disciplinary practices, promotion opportunities, women, people of color. You know, the research shows that there's disparities in that. And so it's even how we treat our own officers, procedural justice, and that beyond the external forces and the constraints, when you get inside, those same things you face in everyday life, you face those and are confronted with it within the organization. I know you know the same thing I'm talking about within the fire department. And so, you know, that really is problematic. And unfortunately, we're just really having these conversations about this. And yeah, that's unfortunate. And that's why reward structures are so important. That's why, you know, programs like the DARE program, it didn't stop adolescents' drug use, but the benefit was it helped mend those wounds with police and juveniles. But apparently that wasn't important. And these things have been dissolved. So yeah, I'll shut up before you get me in trouble today. I do want to say real quickly, I see in the webinar chat real quick that talks about not only citizen sphere of police, but you have police sphere of citizens, right? And it's not just white cops and Black people. You know, it transcends across races. And I always tell students about, you know, nobody's immune from anti-Black messaging. If I'm walking down the street and I see the Migos at 2:00 in the morning in Atlanta, or I see Sophia and the Golden Girls, if I'm going to cross the street, it may not be for Sophia and the Golden Girls, right? And so you do have, when you talk about use of force and things, I just saw this in the chat, you do have this thing where you have increased fear by the citizens, increased fear by officers, whether it's real, perceived, racist driven, whatever it is on both sides. But the problem is you have that moment that you have that confrontation and somebody's killed. And I didn't say this earlier, and I'll kind of shut up on this point. You know, that's a big problem with reform, is that we've lost the humanity in reform. When it's unfortunate when police officers kill someone or hurt someone, but whenever I see police officers kill or die in the line of duty, I don't hear nothing. I don't hear a word. And that's unfortunate that we've come to that point as a society. You know, even when we think about transparency, you know, when I watched Tyrese Nichols' death, murder on TV, I'm like, transparency is good and accountability is good, but when do we become numb to seeing Black men die on TV? And so there's a lot of things that really impact this thinking. There's a lot of issues, and it impacts who becomes a police officer as well. And so I just wanted to make sure I covered that point because I saw it in the chat. So
thank you. Go ahead, Matt.
Dr. Johnson, you mentioned the Kerner Commission report at the very beginning. Thank you for bringing that up, something that's been shelved for the past 50 years. But you also mentioned something pretty interesting, because I think some of your conclusions or some of what you are suggesting were found in the conclusions from the Kerner Commission report. You haven't come out and said that you advocate a federal standard, but you're kind of alluding to that point. Policing in California is very different than it is in Georgia. police makeup, and then even presence of unions, as you mentioned. But to that point, because you're talking about reforming the community, the Kerner Commission report was shelved in favor of the 1968 Safe Streets Act, which introduced the tough on crime attitude. So how do we combat now reform being viewed as soft on crime?
Yeah, and that's a great point. First of all, I love your voice. I don't know what you do
Thanks.
for me for real, but
Thank
you
you.
should be somewhere, man. My God, right? No, you're absolutely right. And this is why I try to take this stance and I take this approach to it, is that just trying to get the information out there, right? These things are not brand new, what I'm saying, right?
Right.
You mentioned it, and it's really dusting off these things. And I think it really paints a picture of how far that we've come a long way, but how far we hadn't come. A federal standard, I believe in federal guidelines, right? I never want to take the power away from local agencies, but I do think that the federal government can help set standards and guidelines and provide funding opportunities with, for instance, like the facial recognition moratorium bill. What it says is, the blueprint for AI Bill of Rights. What it says is that, this is really only concerns federal government and its use, but there's monies tied in for local and state governments, these things. So maybe we can connect monies to it to help them come up to those standards that we want, because we know getting things like Khalil accreditation and others can be really expensive, particularly for a small department. And so I think, you're right. Like, here are minimums that the federal government that we want to set. And even if they're not enforceable, we can make judgments as citizens how well our departments are performing, where are they missing the bar at, and where to make investments in. And so I do think we need national training standards. I know that there's going to be variation, but I think there should be principles to that. And, and Mary asked a wonderful question about even training and community building, just because I didn't answer that, maybe think about it. I didn't receive any training on community building. I didn't receive any training on this de-escalation tactics. The de-escalation tactics was, sir, put your hands up before I mow you in half. That's my de-escalation tactic that I was trained in. I could shoot, run, fight. I was in shape, but and they had this thing called verbal judo. Don't get me started on that. Right? Yeah, exactly. And so it really wasn't that. And so I think we need to provide these standards and take a carrots and sticks approach, but really emphasize the carrots and not the sticks. And what can the federal government do? They can help provide these guidelines and provide monies to help departments and support them to get to these levels. Particularly, we talk about police reform, we leave the rural and smaller agencies out. And I would love to make sure that we include them and provide them with those supports.
I was a police officer when verbal judo was first introduced. I have my own thoughts on that as well. I do want to get to the Q&As, though, from the students. Our first one says, Dr. Johnson, how would you explain equity in underserved communities? What does equity look like in such a situation?
Well, equity means that they're not breathing in polluted air, disproportionately polluted air. Equity means that the schools inside of South Memphis are the same, have the same resources that they have in the suburbs. And so equity for me means that you would have more places of business, means you have more libraries, more green spaces, things that have shown to reduce even violent crime by having more green space than more liquor stores and pawn shops. These are things that we talk about equity that I would love to see, where I can go to a Publix, so I can go to a grocery store instead of going to a Taco Bell. I have access. To me, that's what equity looks like. In places like East Lake Atlanta, if I may take 30 seconds, in East Lake Atlanta, what they did was the federal government helped partner with the big developers. They partnered with nonprofits. And what they did was, there was a place called Little Vietnam. This is during the Vietnam War era. It was a war, they called it a war zone, where police were afraid to go in this area. Food deserts, poor performing schools, and they revitalized that community. You have affordable housing. You have grocery stores, several of them. Hell, Tiger Woods was just at the PGA tournament there a couple of years ago in the same area. But this is the thing, we talk about equity. We have to be mindful that it's different between investing in people and places. So yeah, the crime rates went down. It's a bustling community, but overnight, almost, the community got whiter and became more educated. We can't account for about 22% of the people that left there. Where are they at? And so we dropped the ball on that. And that's okay because we can learn for it. And I don't mean that's okay for them. I mean, we did learn from it, right? That it's not just about investing in places and geographies. We have to invest in people. And doing that, to me, that's equity. Dr. King said, no, it's one thing to ask a man to pull himself up by the bootstraps. But man, it's a pretty horrible thing to ask them to do so when they don't have any bootstraps. All I'm saying is give these resilient people in these communities bootstraps and those opportunities and watch them flourish. To me, that's equity.
So you did, there's a fine line though between creating that type of equity, especially in the Little Vietnam example, and gentrification though.
Yeah.
So where do we, kind of almost blurred?
Yeah, but it's important by the purpose. And that's why it's important that we just can't want people to be benevolent. They were benevolent in this regard, but 22% of the population was gone. And it became wider and more populated. And so I think it goes to show to the dangers of these things. And people will argue, well, gentrification is good. It's bad. It's good if you can afford to be there, right? you know what I'm saying? And so you're absolutely right. And it just shows how much of a delicate balance in that and how careful we have to be when we're talking about doing reform and doing it fairly, right? And last thing, people talk about with this whole politics that, I tell people, listen, if I was a white guy in Midwest America, I live on a farm, I'm poor, and I see affirmative action, I see these other things and these type of things, I'm gonna be pissed off too. And so we have to be mindful that we do so in a way that's geographically fair and responsible, but we make sure we target the places that are suffering the most first and prioritize those.
And that redevelopment is downtown USA, every downtown. Every downtown USA is doing that same project. And that same project, where do the people go? What happened? But we see it in, like I said, every downtown USA. There's a question, are Know Your Rights training provided by ACLU assisting in keeping the public well informed?
So I'm not too familiar with the training per se particularly, but just the idea of it. I think know your rights is important. The one thing when I teach my American course classes to my students, I'm like, you need to bring your families in here, right? Every person who's on this soil should know their rights, right? Because one thing, think about it, consent searches. The vast majority of consent of searches are consent searches, and people simply give consent. Yes, go ahead. Oftentimes because they don't know, they can say no, and the police don't have to tell them that they can say no, right? And so people need to understand and know their rights. And look, I tell them, look, I probably shouldn't say this. Police officers have a job to do. If they need to go do a warrant to do their job correctly and legitimately, well, it's your job as a citizen to exhaust those rights and make them go through the full arm regime of getting the warrant and doing what they need to do. And so I think that's a healthy relationship that police and citizens need to have, right? Because what there is, it adds a layer of accountability. But I will say that my mama always told me that a little knowledge is dangerous. And so we need to make sure that it's very comprehensive and that it's more than just like a 2-hour spot here and there. It's something that needs to be ongoing, very much like with policing as well. I think police officers would also benefit from a know your rights training as well, because we often see instances where citizens oftentimes know rights better than the people who are actually enforcing them. And many times that shows about training. Less about that officer and more about how they've been resourced and more about the department and city that they serve.
We're short on time, but I'm going to read one more question before we close out. When I was growing up, community policing was different because the officers were actually part of the community. The dope boys, prostitutes, etc., weren't afraid of being killed by the officers because they all grew up with the officers that worked in their community. How can officers be trained to get back to this type of policing, or do they want to?
I think the desire is there. You have a lot of reform-minded chiefs who they've either quit, they step down because of political pressures on either side. The job has almost been impossible. They need to make a move just for a change to start refreshment, not for them, but just for their department. I think there is a desire to do that type of work among officers. I do think that they may be becoming far and few in between how we recruit them, because less and less officers with that mindset are maybe willing to join the police force. And so we have a recruitment issue when it comes to that. And you can train officers for this side of policing, but it doesn't matter if you don't reward them for it. If they're not being rewarded for that type of work, why should I do it? Why should I spend hours and hours helping out a community group when I got to put food on the table and I want to get a promotion, when I can spend time writing tickets? And so I think it's less about the officers who are rank and file and more about the cities that govern these police departments and their will to move in that direction and do what they need to do to ensure that that happens. And you're absolutely right. Community policing was different. But unfortunately, those times have changed. And can we get back there? Maybe not. What we can do is remove that trigger through traffic stops and change how we want police to interact with our citizens, i.e. Making contacts that are not punitive and building relationships.
Dr. Johnson, thank you so much for joining us today. I learned a lot, a different angle, but a lot of information. And I just hope in the future we can get you back and talk to you again. And thank you for joining us.
Thank you for having me. I'm glad to hear that. Glad it made sense. And just if I can ever be of assistance to you all, just please don't hesitate to reach out.
Thank you so much.
Thank you,
Thanks,
Dr. Johnson.
Bye.